Thanks for listening to this archive of Teaching American History's Saturday webinar for March 7th, 2020. This Saturday webinar in our American Minds series was about social reformer Jane Addams. We were joined in this program by Dr. Chris Burkett, our moderator, and panelists Dr. Jennifer Keene and Mac Mariani, who discussed her ideas, her letters, and her legacy.
Welcome, everybody, to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach here at Ashland University and am the director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students at Ashland University. In case you're joining us for the first time, the theme of our series this year is American Minds, and the point is to pull together some thoughtful scholars to discuss 10 important persons who we think reflect somehow this thing that Thomas Jefferson called the American mind, and have had an influence on the American mind, how Americans think about important things. So, as always, we encourage those of you joining us to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the chat box, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. If you do submit a question, please make sure you submit it to all participants so that our panelists can see them as well in case they'd like to jump right to a question. In the next week, you'll receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, and that email will also include a link to the archived video and audio of today's discussion. Today we're talking about Jane Addams, and I'm very honored to have with us today Jennifer Keene of Chapman University and Mac Mariani of Xavier University. Thanks for joining us, to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I usually just start by throwing out some broad sometimes rambling thoughts, and then you pick up wherever you want to pick up and go wherever you want to go with this. To help us get into the mind of Jane Addams. Before the program, we were talking about what a fascinating person she is, and I was saying I'm learning more about her, but I was amazed at how little I actually knew about her in terms of her background. I knew she was famous for her work at Hull House, and of course I knew she was a strong advocate for women's suffrage. But I've really been surprised to the extent to which she wrote very insightful works on education, on finding remedies for the kinds of problems that are arising in these new large urban areas, right? The rise of the big cities after industrialization. But I was really impressed with her mind and just how thoughtful she was, and how respected she was by others who we think of as sort of the intellectual leaders of the time. So there was no question in that, I guess. I'm just starting to maybe start with, what is it that both of you find most impressive about Jane Addams, or most interesting about Jane Addams, and then maybe we can get into her background a little bit and sort of the specific things she was calling for in terms of social reforms. Either of you like to start?
I'll start.
Please, thank you, Jennifer.
I think that one of the things that's so interesting about Jane Addams is how do we define somebody as a social activist, and how do they go about sort of coming into that path of life and then deciding how they are going to present their message. And when you read about Jane Addams, the first part of her journey is almost a journey for personal fulfillment, because she herself had terrible health problems as a child. She had curvature of the spine. She wanted to go to medical school, but she was thwarted in that effort because of her health problems. But she was one of these generation of first female college-educated, well-to-do women who then had to think, what can I do with my life besides get married and have children, which didn't really seem in the cards for her. And so she has this sort of personal journey and then revelation about it coming out more about a tradition of Christian charity, about how to help the poor. But then she evolves into really somebody, when you look at the major movements she was connected to, is just pivotal to understanding the rest of social movement evolution and development in the 20th century. She's one of the founding sociologists in an era when sociology as a field of study is being created. She's a founding member of the NAACP. She's a founding member of the ACLU. She wins the Nobel Peace Prize for her staunch pacifism during the First World War. The peace movement being another important movement of the 20th century. And so Hull House is where we all start with Jane Addams, and we do definitely want to talk about Hull House today. But I think that it's just a sort of amazing journey that she goes on in terms of how her whole life unfolds.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. That's been my path to discovering Jane Addams.
Yeah.
It started with her book on, was it 20 years at Hull House? 20 years
at Hull House, yeah.
And then from there, it just becomes even more interesting. So, Mac, you teach public policy, I think, is that right? Or
I do American politics and public policy. Actually, my biggest area of research is probably on gender and politics. So we're
okay.
So I kind of in both regards, as a political scientist, I find her a fascinating person. What my former colleague at Hamilton College, Pete Canavro, is interesting. As I was doing some research into Addams, I run into a really interesting paper on from Pete Canavro about her role as this sort of what Canavro describes as an inflection point for feminism, an inflection point as well for environmentalism. And he highlights, I think, what is a really interesting sort of articulation of this sort of civic republicanism, right? That focuses on, participatory democracy and the idea of public good and the social obligations we have to one another, and the idea that it's not enough to feed the poor, but also to kind of walk with them and to engage them as part of a broader society, right? So there's this idea that the poor, and I guess this partly goes into the Christian charity element of things, is that these are part of our social obligations to one another, and that treating somebody as inherently valuable and is really critical to kind of understanding who they are and being able to help them, not just to provide assistance for temporarily, but to elevate the people around you and elevate yourself by your interactions with them. The other piece of this is this, really interesting sort of idea of civic housekeeping that I think, when you think about what she brings to the table in terms of this really clever sort of way of embracing the traditional roles of women and figuring out how to leverage those sort of stereotypes about women as being relegated to the household in a way that extends the idea of the household beyond where you are to include the city, and also to emphasize the fact that we can't. Our households are not, in fact, isolated, right? What happens in the city, whether it comes to sanitation or education or juvenile justice, all of those things that impact our households. And so she's really playing a key role in kind of redeveloping or recrafting the idea of female citizenship in a way that is tied to this previous notions of femininity and the role of women in their spheres as homemakers, but extending that out to give them a role in public life that was far beyond what most women had back in the 1880s and 1890s.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on that, I mean, as we're sort of looking at now, I think at this one of our documents on women's consciousness and social amelioration, that she's also trying to address the apathy of her class and say, why should I care about these things? I think it's so timely, this essay. There's so many things that we can connect to in our own times, which is that she's also in so many great ways, in 20 years at Hull House, is a better example of this, a propagandist. I mean, she's trying to really sell the message about why what she's doing matters and why every person of her class should care. And in this essay, she's a radical wrapped in the language of a moderate. So I'm not really trying to upend the gendered system. Of course, your family and home is the most important thing that you care about, but you honestly can't take care of them the way that you should in an industrialized urban society unless you start caring about your neighbors and look outside your window, right? It's almost like, you have to look at the greater picture or your family will be at risk. And so almost suggesting in the most, fundamental way, you can't do your job as a mother and a wife if you don't get involved in civic housekeeping. But then she obviously builds that out more to really kind of emphasize, like many progressive reformers at the time, the real injustice and the real danger to democracy that's happening as in a moment of great immigration, if class stratification, continues, if social isolation of different groups and enclaves continues, that we will lose this sense of collective endeavor that makes a democracy work. And I think in that sense, she's sneaky because she's actually, as I think Chris was suggesting earlier, making a much more fundamental argument about how American democracy is going to continue as these new economic changes and demographic changes occur, but wrapping it all up in sort of very traditional gendered notions. And that's, again, what I find so fascinating because it's so smart.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And it's strategizing. And I often think that when we look at social movement culture, we always want to look for principled dedication on the part of the people that found these movements. But these people are savvy too, and they have to think about how they're presenting their movement, how they're not going to scare people off, how they can woo people to their side. And for Hull House, Jane Addams had to do a lot of fundraising. She required not just for these people to care, but for them to open up their pocketbooks and actually support her endeavor. And that was, of course, what was so problematic when she became a pacifist in the First World War, because all these people who had seen her as relatively moderate and had supported her, now she was very radical.
Yeah.
And that was part of the problem there. And it was part of the problem for Hull House because her money dried up.
Well, there's that great story about the woman who took care of her home, right? And she cleaned her home was clean and her home was spotless. Yep. And when her educated daughters came back home on break or whatever, they ended up getting typhoid, right? And one of them died, and the other was essentially hobbled for 2 years. And
how many? How many thought of coronavirus?
Yeah, I know. Very timely. But that idea that the wealthy can't shut themselves out from these problems. That these are social problems that can't be. She's speaking of sanitation, but I think it was also her broader view that all of these problems are things you can't say are isolated to these poor immigrant communities. Mm-hmm. They ultimately affect all of us. Yeah. And if we don't start to understand our obligations to one another as citizens, and our obligation to get involved and address these problems, they're going to come back to bite us.
Yeah. Oh, those are great. On that point and some points that both of you raised earlier, one thing that I think a lot of my students are impressed with about Jane Addams is she's part of that general movement toward what you're just emphasizing, an emphasis on putting aside sort of the more egoistic, self-interested, individualistic, if you will, in the old-fashioned sense, approach to thinking about citizenship and coming to realize that we all have a part in making our society better because we're all part of a larger whole. But what my students really appreciate her is, say, opposed to somebody like Woodrow Wilson, right, and other intellectuals, strictly intellectuals, she's not just giving that message in a very thoughtful way. She's actually doing things. She's there raising money, actually participating in the classes, and talking with people. So I find that she actually gets a great deal of respect because she's not just sort of preaching the message of reform and reforming ethics. Right? She's right on board with that larger message of we've got to not just do this piecemeal, but we're in a sort of progressive vein at the time. We want to reform society and make it reform it along the lines of being much more ethical as they understood ethics. There's
a tension, I think, though, right? Because she's clearly pushing she's a reformer and she's a progressive in many ways, supports Teddy Roosevelt in his Bull Moose campaign, and I think later on speaks for FDR and some others. But there's a tension between, like, she's got this she's critical of the machine politics of the day, right? One of the readings the students did was that about Tammany Hall, right? This idea, this sort of transactional sort of politics of the day that was very corrupt, very much built around self-interest, very much built around the idea that listen, parties are kind of focused on what's good for them, and oftentimes the people who were in charge of things were not necessarily the best people, quote unquote. Whereas the later models of social welfare organization are to think about the progressive reforms ultimately push through the sort of science of politics, right? The science of administration, and very top-down sort of bureaucratic solutions to problems. And it's interesting to the extent that she sits sort of in a different space. She's not transactional and self-interested, but really transformational, but also built around the idea that this is the idea of this sort of faceless bureaucracy. Like I believe she saw government and regulation as being an essential piece of social life, but she also wasn't. This was not an impersonal sort of top-down bureaucracy. This was really the sort of kind of partnerships that the public had to make, and particularly people who were educated, and by educated I mean both traditionally educated, but also the people who were educated through interacting with one another and attending these talks and discussions that would happen at Hull House, to become engaged citizens to solve problems in their own communities. So it's an interesting sort of space she inhabits, because these sorts of solutions end up getting pushed aside to some extent by the fact that we've got bureaucracies to do that now, and so the idea of going and living among the poor and tending to their social needs tends to take a back seat to the government officials who put you on a list and you either qualify or not qualify. It's a very different sort of model of welfare.
I think I never thought this until I was just listening to you, Mac, but I was struck as I was listening to you by actually, in some ways, some of the similarities between Tammany Hall and what Jane Addams is doing, in the sense that they're both, even though they have different motivations and they have different processes for doing it, what they are is basically delivering social services to the poor. And Tammany Hall is going to do it, find you a job, give you a chicken, on Christmas, maybe pay your rent for you in exchange for your vote, right? They want to stay in power, but they are providing social services to their followers. Jane Addams, I mean, besides her general hopes about, we've been focusing about the role for women in this movement, but when you look at Hull House, it is basically a community center. It's a place where women can come and find nursery school, where they're an employment agency. They're helping people in times of unemployment. They're opening art schools, not just advocating for playgrounds, but providing supervisors for them. This whole host of social services that you point out. Now we expect our bureaucracies to take part in, but she's providing that as well. And Hull House is gaining from those services because they also welcome in all of these new sociologists and people who want to conduct social work, and they do investigations and they do research among the residents of Hull House. So if you've ever seen the very famous Hull House maps, where they literally want to map the neighborhood to find out who's living there, where are the houses of prostitution, in a time of outbreak, how does that connect to where poor sanitation facilities are. And these are people who are really coming to study the poor. What we could argue or discuss whether they're also in some ways objectifying them. But there is definitely something that people are getting out of, that the people who come to Hull House are getting out of this relationship. And they're, in a sense, from the perspective of the poor, who do you choose, right? Who are you going to go to get your help from? And that, I think, is one of the major debates of the time. How can you convince, and again, that's more in Hull House than in the readings we had here, where she talks about how she has to convince people in the neighborhood to trust her, to come to her, to not think that she's going to just impose her own standards and etiquette and ways of living on them. And this is when I'm helping me circle back to where I thought I was going to start, which was to Chris's point about the comparison to Woodrow Wilson. Which, as a World War I historian, I have a lot to say about Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah, I know you do.
I won't go down that path today. But the big difference to me between Woodrow Wilson and Jane Addams is Jane Addams has humility. And
that's a great point.
Right. And she is what my students love about her, what I love about her. There's a lot of things to love, but one thing I really love about her is that in her writings, she is always learning something from her neighbors. The immigrants always teach her something. She goes in and she almost presents herself as, I was the do-gooder, I thought I had all the answers, and then I learned something. Like in our readings here. Of course, if you're unemployed, take whatever job you can get. I encouraged this man to take this job. He told me he'd always done indoor work. 2 days later, he contracts pneumonia. Now he's dead. And how is his family really any better off for me following the rules and saying you have to go work, on this drainage ditch? So, and there's a lot of stories that she includes like that. And I think she's trying to send the message that our new immigrant neighbors and, these new Americans have a lot to tell us. That it's not just a one-way street, that we have everything to tell them. And that ability to learn and the humility, I think, is a big difference, I would argue, from the way Woodrow Wilson presents, his ideas of progressivism.
I think that's a very generous way to put it, Jennifer, on your part. Thank you.
I'm feeling charitable.
You're being charitable. I meant.
She's making me feel charitable this morning.
I mean, you're feeling charitable. You're being charitable to Wilson.
Yes.
But that's great. That's wonderful. I was just finished teaching a MAG course on the progressive era, and I had mentioned that a number of psychologists, including Freud, after Wilson's death, did a psychoanalysis. Are you both familiar with? You may be familiar with this. And Freud concluded that Wilson was suffering from a messianic complex.
Yes.
So if Freud, well, anyway, never mind that.
Yeah.
Well, he was an academic, so that's understandable.
Right. But there were so many good points in what you were just raising. And just to circle back a little bit, Jennifer, I think you actually anticipated Billy's question, which he submitted just as you started to speak on this, where he says, given the influence of the party boss, is it fair to say that the sort of logical replacement for such a person or institution was the development of a social welfare system at the city level? So as soon as you started to say that, his question came up. So it's good, perfect timing. But again, and Mac had brought up, sort of Adams' place as a progressive, which I also thought was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned, I just finished teaching the progressive era course, and one of the hardest things to do every time I teach that course is say who is a progressive. I mean, how do you define a progressive at that time? Because there are so many shades of difference among them. Again, they seem to have some things in common, but as you pointed out, Jane Addams was not inclined toward this nationalization of social help and so on and so forth, which was unique. And I always found it interesting that she still signed up to support Roosevelt as the progressive nominee in 1912, because Wilson, of course, had Roosevelt had a record of nationalization, and of course had been was the opposite of a pacifist, to throw that out there as well. So it's interesting to try to figure out where she fits in as a progressive in that margin.
I've always kind of seen it as what ties them together is what they're against, right? Which is the party machinery, right? And so, like, if you think about the progressive, there's kind of that strain of progressivism that is about direct democracy, the introduction of primaries, the introduction of referenda, the introduction of election of senators, things like that. And then there's the idea of expertise, right? And the scientific administration, and both of those, I think, have the mutual effect of reducing the power of party bosses. And so they might not always have agreed on what progressivism is, but they knew what it wasn't.
Well, that's a great way to put it. I'm sorry, Jennifer, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say that I think in Billy's question, what the word I sort of emphasize is city. And I think sometimes, because now we live in in a society where the federal government looms so large and federal policy seems so important, and what happens on the local level seems less significant, right? You can hardly get people to come out for an election if a presidential choice is not in play. But I think that what Jane Addams, these readings and even her strand of progressivism really reminds us is that progressives are probably the most effective on the local level. And when they talked about regulation and a more important role for the government, most often they were the progressives that were actually in the movement, across the country, were thinking about local politics, about city politics, and sometimes state politics. And I think when we take it to the level of just privileging the presidential view of what progressivism is, we lose that really important element of the progressive movement, where their notion that on the local level, a community would kind of replicate almost like the small town environment there was kind of a romanticism to it too, sort of harking back to the idea when everybody knew each other and you could all just, come down to the town hall and discuss, and you really had this personal relationship with the people that were governing you. But now in a big city you don't even speak the same languages. You don't even know people in this part of town, which is another big point she raises here. How can you feel to collect together and feel that you need to come together as one, which is also what she's sort of suggesting in these readings. And so to me, that's hard, because then you're saying, oh, well, are you saying to study progressivism, we have to study 5,000 case studies of how it, operates in all these different communities, which is, in a sense, yes, if we really want to know what it is. But I guess my big point here is we shouldn't overemphasize the national, because that's where our gaze is in our moment in time, without privileging the way she's pulling us into Chicago. She's talking about Chicago. And that detail that she's giving us, it matters, because the specific problems that Chicago has may not be the problems that New York has, may not be the problems that San Francisco has, but the point is more the approach is what progressives could have in common.
Well, and you can imagine there's that one, again, she's great with stories. That's one of the great things about her writings, is that she's drawing on her experiences. And there's the story about there's so much garbage on the street, that they dig through and they find they forgot there was even a street there, that there was actually pavement there. They dig down, and I think it's like 12 inches or 18 inches below the surface of what people are walking on and horses are riding on is an actual paved street. And so, when you imagine that these sorts of problems that people are dealing with, and the problems of administration in the realities of what used to be, if you go back to this sort of agrarian lifestyle, the implications of what we do in terms of sanitation, the implication in terms of public health, noise, crime, all those other things are dramatic. They're exponentially more difficult to deal with once you get into a city and an urban environment, and the need for administration and then the parties step into the breach, but they're very ineffective. They're very, they're administering their policies in a way that helps certain groups and doesn't help others. There's an inequality there, both an inequality in terms of the benefit, but also an inequality in terms of who gets served and who doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
that really doesn't fit well with the idea of a democracy of all, right? And so there's these questions of democracy that come up beyond just the questions of administration.
Yeah.
Those are
And
great points.
I think that she's so interested in identifying who are the most vulnerable in our society, and in her view, it's really women and children, and she has many of these stories that she's relating to us, have to do with women who are they're either immigrants, or they're poor, or they have husbands that abuse them or abandon them. They're young
Right.
mothers. Her examples again are of these very small children who are either locked in tenements to be safe or sent out into the streets, and then are, of course, the temptation for vice as they become older is present, especially young girls. Are they going to fall into prostitution? And so all of these ways of also identifying who are the most vulnerable and really victims of the environment in which they live. And I do think that it's worth also maybe pulling in some social Darwinism at this moment, because of course she was also in an intellectual environment where attitudes towards the poor, as today, were very conflicted. I mean, are the poor really people that we should feel sorry for, that we should empathize? Should we feel sympathy for them? Should we feel empathy for them? Should we feel contempt for them? Should we feel fear of them? Right? Those are kind of the gamut of emotions, which I would say we still have, and those are emotions we project onto immigrants, onto people who are mired in poverty, and who are different than us in terms of their socioeconomic background, their ethnic background, their racial background, the languages that they speak. And I think that she's trying to emphasize our shared humanity, and the sense that you can connect to these people and their situations as human beings. And she's trying to explain why would somebody find themselves in this situation, not because they're a bad person or they're idle or their racial stock is less than yours, but because let me explain to you how they live, what has happened to them, situations that are out of their control. And she does that without also acknowledging that there are some people who make bad choices. So she in that sense, she's very progressive. I mean, you could see the same sort of argument being made by Jacob Riis, by Louis Hine, by so many of the major reformers of the time, who take a very similar kind of approach to how they want to educate, the other half about how the other half lives. And that, I think, it really connects her also to this larger movement of reformers that are out there trying to spur people's social consciousness.
Yeah. Well, that's really that your point about the from the social Darwin perspective is really amazing. So it's she's not just going to leave them behind and let them sink, because that's the natural progression of things. That's fascinating.
Yeah. And that's in the intellectual environment of the time, right?
Yeah.
This is very much what people are arguing about.
Well, that's fascinating. And again, I think I know when I started reading Jane Addams, my favorite piece, by the way, which we didn't recommend, I probably should have, is Spirit of the Youth in the City Streets. And it really showed to me just how new these problems are that she's dealing with the rise of these massive cities, these major urban areas, is a fairly recent phenomenon, right? That she's dealing with in the post-industrialization age. And so there are all these new problems that you've been bringing up that in the old sort of idyllic way of thinking about small town life or even family life, we really didn't have to deal with these sorts of problems. There were other problems that they were dealing with, but as you brought up, prostitution, gang life, right, is rampant in cities. Alcoholism, of course, drug use is on the rise. Unwed pregnancies, she's concerned with, and trying to educate women with regard to that. Sexually transmitted disease, STDs, right, domestic abuse. She sees all of these on the rise as a result of this very sudden conflux of people in these urban areas, and somebody has to find ways to deal with these things. And But those problems are so new
Yeah.
that sometimes I think her methods, in some sense, some people think her methods are rather radical. I noticed the question here. I'm talking a lot. I apologize, but Danita, Danita, I think I'm picking up your vibe here. She's not necessarily a huge fan of some of her policies. So Danita mentions that she had been taught that some of the classes that Jane Addams had been teaching at Hull House actually caused conflict in some families. But I think what Jane Addams is trying to recognize is the family, as we used to know it, it simply doesn't exist anymore, and we have to be realistic, at least in the big cities, right? We have to be realistic about how to preserve the family by educating women, especially, about what the modern urban family is going to be like. Anyway.
I think that there's certainly some room for criticism of and Jane Addams has been criticized for what I think is a sense of paternalism. Part of this idea of like bringing creating a space for arts and music and discussions and talks is the idea of elevating the immigrants because they need to be kind of reconciled with American culture, right? These are immigrants from Italy or Poland, and they've got these sort of backwards notions that need to be replaced with a more American sort of mentality. But I think there's also a clear sense, and I think Jennifer talked about this a little bit. There's a clear sense that she's very frequently acknowledging what she's learning from the immigrants, and the fact that there's more, that it's a two-way street. And I think the idea that immigrants have something to add to the society and that we might learn a great deal from them comes out in a very specifically in a number of her writings. But there is at the same time a sense that the immigrants have notions of government, and in particular you see it in that fight with the machine, right? With Joe Powell or whatever, the city council person, right? Is that she's trying to get the immigrants in the community around her to recognize that that the machine ultimately, even though they might be able to find you a job and they might be able to they might be there when you need a turkey for Thanksgiving or whatever it happens to be, that truly transforming your life and change and raising your consciousness about what's possible requires us to move past what the machines can offer. And it makes me think of, there's this guy Gaventa who writes about power, right? And there's these three kind of dimensions of power that he describes. One is the sort of pluralism of, we've got groups and some groups don't have enough resources to win these sort of battles in the public sphere. The second dimension of power relates to kind of the mobilization of bias, the fact that actually some groups are mobilized out. But the third dimension of power, which is I think the one where she's operating on, is this notion of consciousness, right? She's trying to get the people in her community to envision a world that didn't rely on the machines, and to envision a different sort of society even. So she's kind of working on this consciousness level. And to some extent, she's also doing that with not just with the immigrants, but with her own class. Like, look out your window, right, and see, how many poor kids do you see? And is the idea that we've become sort of ignorant, and there are all these problems that are kind of invisible to us, and that once we kind of recognize when we can see these problems and also see solutions that aren't even on the table, different ways of organizing our society and different ways of thinking about politics, that's how we can kind of move past the problems of the industrial age, I think is where she is. And again, she's not perfect, and she certainly carries some of the baggage of that kind of mid 18th century suffrage movement, right? Which is the sort of not always hidden disdain for these sort of lower classes. She's moved past that to a great deal, but she carries some of that baggage as well.
Mac, just really quick, sorry I think again Billy had anticipated your comment. He's on fire today.
You're right. You should be part of the. You should join in.
Well, I hope that answers your question, Billy. I think that was very well put. I'm sorry, Jennifer.
I was going to say that I think Jane Addams can always be criticized in the context of her times from some of the people who are making different arguments about why women should be involved in politics or have a voice. And that is not from the argument of women are different and women have different responsibilities and women have a different sphere, but rather the argument that women are equal and women should be able to be in politics because they should have equal rights to men. And you can see that in some of her writings. I mean, this is also the time when there will be a fracture in the women's movement with women like Alice Paul, who are going to leave NASA, the more moderate women's rights organization, and are going to be arguing from a position of equal rights, which is different than what Jane Addams is saying. Jane Addams may not be living this, but in her rhetoric, she is always conforming to gendered notions of what women's role in society is. Even in her pacifism, no mother wants to raise her son to die in war. Women are naturally pacifists. So you need women in the public sphere because they have different concerns. They will bring a different voice. They're different than men. And just like, every family needs a mother and a father, so should the body politic. And so it's this notion of operating within those gendered norms that she always goes, and she uses that and she's part of the progressive movement that uses this to get protective legislation for women and children. And that's because those are, women are different, so they need to have fewer hours of work. They need to have these special social services from the government provided to them. You can see in some of her writings, aid for women to dependent children, what's going to happen in the New Deal. You kind of see the nuts of that the nutshell of that argument being created here. And that does put her in opposition with other women who begin to develop a very different argument for why women should have the vote, should be able to be in politics, should be able to go to college and have careers and live their lives. And so so rather than just thinking of Jane Addams as, from the kind of political side, even within the political movements that she's a part of, there are more radical wings that we might find those arguments more acceptable today than the Jane Addams arguments.
Right.
Well,
I'm sorry, Matt, go ahead.
I also think it's interesting that she herself doesn't live that.
No, I know, that's right. Yeah, she's not her.
She is
what she's saying.
this sort of she's an independent. Obviously, she's independent. She's out in these very dangerous situations consistently. She gets the job as the city garbage inspector, right? A very unladylike job, right? Where she's literally following the party nominated garbage men, right? And making sure they're doing their work, and all of this stuff is. She's at once reinforcing those norms and breaking them at the same time. Yeah. And there's part of me that I think she's too consistent about it to not be true to. I think she does kind of believe those norms to some extent, but I think there's you can also make the argument that casting women's advancement in that way is probably there's also a certain tactical benefit to it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
Although I think that it's maybe not as tactical with her. Just she seems to be very.
Well, I think she's like Booker T. Washington. I mean, you can have the same sort of critique of Booker T. Washington at the time, where he really, is the sense of we have to pull our, for African Americans, you have to start at the bottom of life and move up. You need to be in the crafts and the skills. as opposed to, and kind of incrementally accept this gradualist approach to civil rights, contrasting him with Du Bois, who's like integration now, equal rights now. But then if you look at how Booker T. Washington also lived his life and the causes that he secretly funded, you're left with, well, what is he? Is he just strategizing, or does he really believe this? And so you can get into that debate with him as well. But I think the key thing is that because of whatever they believed or how they lived, they did impact the way people thought about these issues through their writings and their speeches. And we will see that in the 1920s, when women do have the right to vote, that, with the Equal Rights Amendment, and again, a split in the movement about whether or not this should be supported, because it would undo in the fears of a lot of women who had erected these protective laws for women. It would erase those, and they're worried about that because they say, well, we want to go back. I mean, we fought hard to get those laws. So is that what an Equal Rights Amendment is going to do? And so I think it again sets up future debates and future tensions about how do women really secure their role in public life, and do they do it by shattering gendered norms and expectations, or do they work within them to achieve those rights? And again, this to me is a very timely argument.
No, this is very well put. You're putting this much more eloquently and thoughtfully than I was thinking. But this is my point earlier about some of the things that Jane Addams is dealing with are so new. From our current perspective, we look back and we can say, well, she wasn't radical enough, or we can say, even some of the things she's suggesting she seems to share the prejudices of the day, which I think is also true. But that's a little unfair, I think, of us from our modern perspective to say, well, she's supposed to be this great reformer. Why does she have these opinions about immigrants, and why doesn't she, a little more forthright and things? But the political considerations here, I think, are extremely important. But I also think it's important to keep in mind she is a front runner, a forerunner of these things. So if we think the reforms, as you were saying, Jennifer, the conversation, the dialogue that comes out of this, out of the things that she's calling for, have been good for society, then I think we need to give her the credit, at least, of really setting the dialogue in motion in a way, right? Despite, again, some of the prejudices that might be revealed, again, from our modern perspective. So.
And I think the way that she humanizes the immigrant experience, and the way that she really talks about their skills and their emotions and it's honestly, it's something we use again some more of today, to not just be looking at immigrants as this undesirable group that's come to to drag American society down, but instead, which
was a pretty common view at the time,
absolutely,
right?
I mean, absolutely. With these undesirable immigrants from portions of Europe. I mean, she's speaking a lot about Italians who were very looked down at the time, and really trying to affirm them, and sort of talking about, what did they do in their villages, and why do they want to keep doing things this way? Even something like doing the laundry, that, in your village, going out into the square, and it's a social event. It's something you enjoy doing. It brings the community together. And now you come to America, and you're supposed to just be washing these clothes alone in your small kitchen, and that, so trying to explain, some immigrant practices, but then at the same time addressing this divide that develops between Americanized children and their immigrant parents, where then their children even look down on their parents, and how this can be disruptive of the family. As you were suggesting, what happens to the family when children don't respect their parents anymore and don't think that they can have authority over them. And that, in itself, leads to a host of crimes. And so just her efforts to sort of valorize these parents' skills and their crafts and their traditions is also, I think, a way to change the view of immigrants, but then also strengthen the immigrant family, have the children look at their parents as, she sort of validates these parents' abilities, like carving or singing or spinning, and in turn, her authority as an American woman then conveys pride in children to their parents, if that makes sense.
No,
and,
that was yeah, that's
and I think that dynamic she's aware of, because if you destroy the family, it all begins with the family, right? And it goes up from the family to the neighborhood, to the community, to the city. So if you destroy the family, then none of these things can work. And so in that sense, again, she's very progressive in the broadest sense of all, right? Even today, we talk about, the importance of the family as really being the center of social stability.
Yeah.
So I think that she's very, we're living under the influence of so many of the ideas and problems that she identified. I had one more thing to say,
but please,
I feel like I'm talking a lot here. So the one other thing I did want to mention here is that I think that some of the things that are undone by the progressives, in other words, the things they are not successful at, she is also in these writings kind of foreshadowing for us a lot of the New Deal. So the problems of unemployment, the problems of old age, the problems of women who are abandoned by their husbands. I mean, if you think about the Social Security Act of 1935, that's like the progressives, they finally succeed.
Yeah.
She succeeds a little bit in a piecemeal way at a local level, but that is a moment where it does seem to require a national solution. And so if you think about the components of that law, that is sort of showing how, FDR and the New Deal, these are all the progressives. They're back, they're back with a vengeance, and and now they're going to use the power of the national government to do what they were unsuccessful in doing in the 1910s.
That's fascinating.
So to me, that you really are seeing like progressivism part 2 in the New Deal, especially in the second New Deal, when you start seeing a lot of effort being paid now, not just to, stemming the bleeding because of the financial crisis, but actually making permanent social reforms.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I had not thought of that before. That's a great parallel. So again, we have a lot of great comments coming in, and as we were saying earlier, my take again, give Jane Addams credit where it's due. I mean, some of her suggestions I think are misses, but again, given her circumstances, this is what happens when you're trying to find new solutions to new problems. But I chuckled, Mac, when I saw your response on the Italian baths that she recommends. That's a great response. So, okay, maybe a silly idea, but the point is she is trying to find new ways of doing things in this particular moment in history. Billy submitted a question. Did Jane Addams support the Blue Book of 1917? I don't know what that is. Do either of you know what that is?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll look it up. I have no idea what that is. Or Billy, maybe you can give us some background on that. Israel asked, noticed in light of our conversation, how different she seems to be from others of her particular background, and how she was able to step out to a large extent in her views on gender roles and immigrants and these sorts of things. So Israel just asked, what do you both think drove her to be, concerned about what she was concerned about and to be who she was?
My sense is that, a big piece of it to me is, I think that she saw in the settlement houses an opportunity to play a role in public life that women were not afforded. Mm-hmm. So it was, she threw herself into something that allowed her to achieve the sort of impact on the world that she would have been unable to achieve elsewhere because of the gender constraints, right? If she had been married, right, it would have created, in particular, a huge constraint on her ability, because she would have been immediately thrown into one of those households that she had to be responsible for. Whereas I think that she was somebody who recognized early on that the constraints of society on women prevented her from achieving the sort of things she wanted to achieve. So she went a different way, and I think the settlement houses offered a sort of creative an outlet for her immense creativity and passion. Like, I mean, this is also somebody who's just absolutely, I mean, she's working the amount of hours that she must put in a given week. Just tireless, creative, constantly seeking stimulation from, I mean, you think about all the, the benefit that the immigrants gained from having all these dances and artists come and talks that were given and recreational activities of all sorts. That was also a form of stimulation for her and her mind, right? I think she was probably looking for an outlet for herself in a way. So I think that as much as anything drove her to do the sorts of things that she did, right? I think she benefited as much as anyone.
That's a great point.
And she wasn't by herself. I mean, she founded Hull House with Ellen Starr, and she, I think that also, she sort of found her own family. I mean, she didn't get married, but she had relationships, and she sort of found that family with like-minded progressives, and many of them came and spent long periods of time at Hull House. So these, in a sense, really, and she had independent means. I mean, she inherited wealth. She had the money to get it started. So she had a way to kind of invest in her own future. And I think that she, at the times in which she lived, she kind of wandered into this community of people who were all part of this movement. And I think once she got started, it obviously took on a life of its own. I doubt this is what she envisioned when she, went to Europe and visited Toynbee Hall and got inspired about trying to bring that model to the U.S. But it certainly took on a life of its own. And then as she got older, she then moved into, many more issues. I mean, she got interested in the issue of racial discrimination, much more about women having the right to vote, obviously issues about international peace. I mean, she goes to Europe in 1915 to try to be part of this Women's Peace Party, a movement at The Hague of visiting all the belligerent governments and trying to almost outside the normal channels of diplomacy negotiate some sort of peace settlement. I mean, that's way out of just being in Chicago, thinking about helping women, get through a hard winter. And so she really pretty soon is almost at the level of an international diplomat, traveling the world, dealing with the most important issues of war and peace of her time. So she definitely evolves as she goes.
That's a remarkable story. I mean, because it reminds me, by the way, from her background. I mean, she did not complete her. She didn't get a BA, right? Because of
I think she graduated from the female seminary.
The female seminary, that's right. Okay, but she didn't get to finish medical school.
That's right. She had to drop out of medical school.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think it's also worth noting, again, she came from a very prominent Republican family. Yes. I mean, right. Capital R Republican.
They revered Lincoln. Lincoln was family friends, and I mean, that was, again, in Hull House. She has a whole essay just devoted to Lincoln, and yeah.
Yeah, and again, the Republican Party is the hub of, I think it's where the progressive impulse is coming from in a political level, right? It's that group within the Republicans. So I was thinking again, she's grown up with a kind of I don't know if I'm using the right term, but a kind of having probably heard from being around her father and others ideas of reform and progress in certain ways. So.
And her father agreed to let her become educated. I mean, I think that's an important thing as well, that she didn't have to break with her family to do any of this. I mean, they had concerns about her health, but when she wanted to go to medical school, her stepmother, I think her father was dead by that point, moved with some of the family to Philadelphia so she could do this. So she had family support as well, and I think that makes a big difference. If her father's like, I disown you if you think you even want to step foot in this, in terms of a college environment. Obviously, her life, it would have been much harder for her to do what she. So he believed in her having an education. Her illness when she was younger caused her to become a great reader. She read, deeply and thoughtfully, and again in Hull House she talks about her own education, how she, young, naive, not really understanding things, and how she again, this sense of humility she has of how she grew and she learned and she studied. And she has in Hull House this great moment where she goes to visit Tolstoy, and she's revered him, in terms of him living with the poor and thinking that he's going to be so impressed with her. And she goes to visit him, and he looks at her dress, and she has this dress with these enormous sleeves. And he looks at her with disdain and says, "Do you know how many dresses could have been made, from that fabric on your dress?" Right. And she leaves completely chastened, like, "Oh my gosh, she thinks I'm an idiot." I mean, she doesn't say it that way, but it's again this sense that she's searching and learning and being corrected and so she's self-reflective in the way of her own vanity and her own missteps as a kind of misguided woman. And again, how much of this is true and how much of this is her again kind of conforming to the ideas of
that's a great question.
What a young woman does and how she has to be corrected and set on the right path. I don't know, but that's probably worth thinking about as well.
Yeah, that's great. There you go. There you go, Israel. Great to see you, by the way. Israel's mag grad, but two thoughtful answers to your good question. So. And then Stacy, our friend Stacy Moses, asked a follow-up to your earlier point, Jennifer, and Mac has been chatting responses too, so I'd like to hear both your thoughts on this. So this is on your point about how FDR institutionalized solutions to the problems that Jane Addams had been trying to deal with. So as Stacy asked, does that mean that if it hadn't been for the Great Depression, those progressive ideas of Jane Addams would not have been implemented?
Oh, what if questions. Ooh. That's tough on a Saturday morning.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's a great question because the progressive movement, there's always these historical debates about, did the progressive movement die in the 1920s? Did it just go underground? Did it just get diverted into more of cultural issues as opposed to political solutions for America's ills? But I do think that I guess I'd put it this way. I don't think that when FDR came in that, he was a progressive. And if you look at FDR's speeches, he always begins with our great father, Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
Right. He reveres Woodrow Wilson, reveres progressivism, and that in the Democratic Party. So even though Jane Addams was a Republican, obviously by the 1930s, it was the Democratic Party that had kind of really latched onto that tradition as their own. And in that New Deal coalition that he constructed, there were progressives that did see this as the moment. Obviously, with the Townsend movement, that also is focusing on old age in the early 30s as really, this is what happened. The Depression has exacerbated that and made it more visible in terms of the problems of old age. That definitely provided an opportunity. But if you didn't have those ideas, in a sense that people had that wing of the political movement was already committed to those ideas,
right?
Would they have seen the moment of the Great Depression as the moment to institute this? And I
think
that's
a great point.
So that's where sometimes the failures of earlier movements are important to understand because they come back at at another moment in time. They don't die; they're still there. But when now that group comes back into political power, they can start putting into action things that they've believed for a long time.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I found I really circumvented that what if. So
no, but that's a great way to put it. I mean,
that's my best answer.
Again, a great by pointing out FDR's always talking about, he calls Wilson my great progressive captain and my father. And
yes.
So FDR is an institutionalist, right? And at least his advisors are, right?
Yeah.
But at heart, he is an institutionalist.
Yeah. And also, you can see the progression then of with Hoover in the Great Depression, who says he's also a progressive. Herbert Hoover is also a progressive, but of the kind of maybe even more with Jane Addams. This is a local problem. Towns have to step up, states have to set up. FDR is and Hoover's moving towards the idea it's a national problem. We need national solutions. Just at the very end of his administration. And FDR is kind of picking up that theme. Yeah. And that's where we could ask, is the Depression really the key thing? Because the national scope of that seemingly requires, especially, by 1933, national solutions And that would be something that you don't see a Jane Addams saying. Jane Addams is not saying, you know what we need? We need a National Unemployment Act, or we need national old age pensions. She's not saying that. So that's where I think you could definitely see the Depression making a big impact.
That's a great point.
Well, and I think the other piece of the Depression is you don't without the depth of the Depression, you don't get the massive majorities that make some of those things possible.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah. Is that, Mac? Is that what you meant? Because I was going to ask you in the chat, you replied to Stacy's question at the national level, probably not, at least not then.
Yeah. So I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't get it eventually, or that there'd be a sea change in sort of, or a slow change maybe in how people thought. But I think the thinking about the role of the national government in particular, and the sort of hesitancy on the part of Americans, at least by tradition, to expand national power and in particular executive power, would have been far more limited. The political possibilities for Roosevelt would have been far more narrow. You still would have governed as a progressive, but the sort of sweeping changes that you saw would have just been politically impossible, I think. So, that's part of it. I also think that what's interesting is that those sort of sweeping national changes and those sweeping policies also are somewhat disconnected from the social, the kind of the aspect of the ability of local people at the ground to connect with those in need on a personal and social level, right? The idea of social capital that comes with, and that was so critical, I think, to Adams' notion of how to address problems, right? These are problems that that fundamentally require us to work together, and that individuals have individual problems that are, that they're not interchangeable. And I think national solutions often come with this sort of sweeping idea of, well, we can fix this. But whereas individual problems require something different. And I also think that there's a notion probably that's more difficult to achieve at the national level of what are the obligations to, not everyone, and this kind of goes back to the idea of who's deserving of help. But there are certain people who aren't. There are certain expectations on the part of the people you're helping, right? And I think that there's a certain limitation on helping those who are actually, actively kind of pulling themselves down. That there are times when Adams kind of moves on from helping certain people who are going in the wrong direction. That is a little bit different. The other piece of this, I think, that interests me is the extent to which, in particular after the Great Society, and the sort of failures of these sort of national solutions to housing and other things, where you start to see in the last 20 to 30 years, community groups that are sort of rising to fill in the gaps, this sort of recognition that, yes, resources are important, and yes, national solutions are sometimes necessary, but that people ultimately need more than resources, and resources have a limit in terms of the sort of change that they're going to make to a community. And so you see community organizations that they're not built necessarily around the Hull House model exactly, but they're serving the same sort of social functions, right? Helping to transform people, right? Think of this sort of transformational approach to social service, as opposed and treating people as individuals and as people, as opposed to just simply delivering resources. That it's the idea of going into communities and being part of the community as being a critical sort of thing, as opposed to working at an office and then driving back to your suburb and at the end of the day. And that's a different sort of model, I guess, of service delivery.
Yeah, that's a great point, Mac. As you were speaking, I was thinking of Barack Obama as an interesting example of or maybe an interesting question to think about, whether he's more as a reformer, more in the Jane Addams camp or the FDR camp in terms of institutionalizing things. And what made me think of that, just to lay the groundwork here, we have just a couple of minutes left. So what I was going to ask at the end is, where do we see Jennifer, you mentioned this sort of dialogue that Addams started. Where do we see that dialogue at today? Not so much in terms of what's left of her project to be completed, but in terms of where are we at with regard to the national solution versus a social organizer model for dealing with these problems. And again, that's why I mentioned, as you were speaking, I was thinking of President Obama, who of course came from a social organizer background.
Yeah. In Chicago.
In Chicago, of all places, right? It's very interesting parallels there.
Yeah.
Who becomes president of the United States, and of course, with regard to healthcare, tries to implement a national solution to that. But in a lot of President Obama's rhetoric, his political rhetoric, I actually see a lot of Jane Addams in his calls for a return to local communities caring for their fellow citizens and trying to find local solutions to things. So I was wondering if there wasn't a strange sort of middle ground between FDR and Jane Addams in the example of Barack Obama. And maybe that's an oversimplification, but.
Well, I'd actually have a different kind of answer to your question. I think that in terms of the issues that are being raised that I think, really can resonate with us, there's a lot, but I think maybe two that we haven't maybe fully explored is, one, I think it's with the criminalization of youth, and especially in her case, immigrant youth, but in our case, maybe Black youth, where the sense of her trying to create a juvenile justice system and also to create explanations for why a gang of kids would break in and steal something. And, is this the kind of crime that, how do we explain this? And it's easy to fall back on the sense of a degenerate race we're just going to throw them away because they're damaged goods, and versus how much of a rehabilitative approach do we take to juvenile crime. And Jane Addams was very much on the forefront of creating a juvenile justice system that argued that the children needed to be considered differently. And really, since the 1950s, in America, we've been moving gradually away from that. And I think that some of that we're reckoning with today in terms of thinking about, especially the criminalization of Black youth in the American imagination of our time. The second thing clearly has to do with immigration. I mean, we have lived through a wave of historic immigration to the United States, and are immigrants benefits or drains on American society? Are they bringing social problems and poverty into our midst that we have to then take care of, or are they generating prosperity? Are they culturally, is the goal to just completely assimilate them, or do we become a multicultural, diverse society? I think that she's living in an age where Americans are grappling with that, and she's grappling with different solutions, and that's very much part of our social dialogue as well. And so, to me, there's a lot of important issues that she brings up, and she's in some ways maybe more relevant to study than ever. It breaks my heart when I give her readings to students and they've never heard of her.
Oh, yeah.
Because to me, it's just incredible that she really is an amazing person. And like I said, it's not just for historical reasons. And the last thing that I love that she says, so I am a history professor, but in the last 8 months, I've become dean of arts, humanities, and social sciences college at my school. So I have to make cases to people all the time about the value and relevance of the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And what I love about her is that she's saying, she also lives in a time like we do, where people say, well, the reason to get it, why should you get an education if it's not going to lead to a good job? Why even bother going to college? And she has that in her time. I say, well, these working class kids are going to go work in factories. So who cares if they're educated or not? Who cares if they're exposed to the arts or music? I mean, they're just going to be factory workers, and that's what their lives are going to be. And she makes a strong argument for why the arts matters in everybody's life, that you're not just what you're going to do at work. And I have to say, I have to make that argument every day right now, all the time. So I appreciated the fact that she had to address that in her.
That's a great point
as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I especially appreciate her emphasis on the arts. I was a fine arts major as an undergrad, and
See?
and I occasionally I'd still paint as a way to
exactly.
Is that your
escape from
painting
some of
right
the things.
behind you there, Chris?
That's not my painting. No, I wish I was that good. I'm not that good. But so Mac, we're out at the end of our time here. But did you have any?
Yeah, you know, what was I thinking of? The now I've lost the point.
Sorry, I want to talk too much.
Yeah, I know. No. It's not that at all. I think it's you talked about Barack Obama, and I think one of the challenges I think he had, I think the way he sort of reconciled it was through there's a concerted effort to kind of funnel portions of money to different community organizations. I think community organizations had over the course of the 8 years of the Obama administration were oftentimes they weren't quite the center of funding, but they were not completely forgotten either. Mm-hmm. So I think that, but the challenge of those sorts of activities, at least at the federal level, it's as much. Federal government is very, very good at writing checks, and it's a very easy, Social Security. I mean, if you think about the pinnacle example of a very successful program, federal program, Social Security has been a tremendous benefit in terms of reducing poverty among the aged, but that's a relatively easy thing to do in terms of just writing checks. The challenge is more at the community level, and how do you, when you get down to the community level, what it's so it's oftentimes disconnected from what communities need. I mean, I know in the case of Cincinnati, we had a very big debate in the last probably last decade or so about transportation funding, and we ended up building a streetcar, and the streetcars struggled. But to some extent, why did we have a streetcar? Well, we have a streetcar because there was federal transportation money available to build a streetcar, right? And,
right.
If we had listed 100 priorities in our community, I would bet a streetcar would have come in the bottom 5 10 years ago. But that's where the money was, and so that's what we did. And so there is this sort of the federal government does provide, there's federal resources to localities, but they're often disconnected from the actual problems those localities have. Yeah. And so that, that I think fundamentally that President Obama struggled to make those connections, as maybe would have been much more better off running for mayor of Chicago than president of the United States. He might have been more comfortable in that position.
But by the way, so the way you describe it, again, I see that as a problem that comes right out of the Great Society, right? Because Johnson had envisioned these federal administrators working with community action, the CAPS, community action projects or partnerships or something like that. And it very quickly became driven from the top down. We'll fund, but they became disconnected from the real needs of the local communities. And so that problem has, persisted.
So, and let me say one other thing is I think the other thing to look for as you're going through this is very interesting to think about, like the issues of what we would describe as white flight, but there's this sort of wealth flight away from these immigrant neighborhoods. As the immigrants start to move in, the wealthy move out, right, and to other parts of the city. And it's sort of interesting that there's a lot of the idea of class segregation, right? Charles Murray talks about this a little bit in Coming Apart as well. This idea that we live and when we live and we marry and we work with people of a similar class, and that limits our perspective about what the problems of the world are, and it limits the possibilities for actually solving the problems that are actually mutual problems that we have. I think is something that Jane Addams would argue.
Yeah, well, it's a great point. That's a great point to end on. And again, we're a little bit over time, and I'm thankful for both of you to join us this morning and share your thoughts on these things. It's been a very great, lively conversation, and I've learned a great deal. Have a lot to think about, and I hope others who've joined us have as well. So Jennifer, Mac, thank you so much. Really appreciate
Thank you.
your time.
Thanks all the, sorry we didn't get to all the
Yeah.
questions. Thank you to all the students, and hopefully this was helpful.
Yeah.
I look forward to seeing you guys this summer.
Yeah, fantastic.
Likewise.
Yep. Yeah, there's some great questions. So thanks for submitting those questions. Just a reminder before we end about the email that you'll receive with your link for certificate of participation. And if you have enjoyed our conversation today, look into some of the other resources that Ashbrook provides, including free one-day seminars. We do those in over 20 states. They're based on original documents and discussion along the lines of what we've just done. So go to tah.org and click on seminars at the top of the screen, and you'll find a list of one-day seminars that you might be interested in attending. So thanks again for joining us. Our next Saturday webinar will be on Douglas MacArthur. That's a big leap from Jane Addams, but that'll be April 4th, Douglas MacArthur. So hope to see you all then, and take care until then. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks again for listening to this webinar. Our next webinar will take place on April 4th of 2020, when we'll focus on General Douglas MacArthur. You can find out information about all our upcoming and archived webinars at tah.org/programs/webinars. And on our site, you can also access any of several thousand documents and other documents-related resources for the teaching of American history, government, and civics. Thanks again.